Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, we're looking at a video put out by Father Casey of Breaking in the Habit. Last time we saw him, he was condescendingly suggesting that an atheist isn't good at being an atheist unless they've read a bunch of atheist philosophy and the works of several Catholic theologians. And if that's the bar for being a good atheist, then it should apply to all the other religions as well, right? So it's actually physically impossible to be a good atheist in that way, as that would require spending your entire life doing nothing but reading the works of theologians from all of the world's religions. Of course, he didn't even consider the existence of other religions. Obviously, the only options are atheist or Catholic. So in this video, he purports to explain why God doesn't answer prayer. So let's take a look at that.
Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who seeks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened.
Yep, and to preempt the inevitable argument that God always answers prayer, but sometimes the answer is no, or the you asked for the wrong thing, or whatever other excuse, that verse doesn't say ask for the right thing and it will be given to you, seek and you shall find, as long as you're seeking something that God wants you to seek, knock and the door will be open to you unless you're there for something that God doesn't want to give you. It stated unconditionally, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. Of course, being Catholic, he would probably not approve of my overly simplistic way of looking at this. Catholics are not tied to a literal interpretation of the Bible as many evangelicals are, but this does add to the case against a God in my mind, as the Bible is very adamant that God always keeps his promises, and this very much reads as one of God's promises, even if you can find the interpretational wiggle room to get away from what this verse is actually saying.
These are the words of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. Encouraging words of God's care for us, inspiring words of the power of prayer. There is nothing beyond God's grasp, and so seek out God, and he will be with you.
I mean, Jesus literally prayed that God take the cup away from him, meaning that he did not want to be crucified. Jesus is supposed to be God, so is this God saying, hey, me? Yeah, I don't want to do that thing anymore, and all things are possible through me, so maybe don't make me do it? And yet God did not answer his own prayer? Same goes for that verse where Jesus prays for unity among his disciples, and all that come to believe through them. We can see that there was theological disagreement among Christians beginning before even the earliest Christian writings. In fact, most of Paul's writings were him disagreeing with what other Christians were teaching, including Peter, the direct disciple of Jesus, on whom Jesus said he would build his church. And yet, we don't have a single writing from Peter, and the earliest Christian writings were from Paul's sect, which disagreed with Peter on a number of issues. And Paul ended up being the foundation of the church, not Peter. So I guess Jesus was wrong when he said that Peter would be that foundation, and he was wrong when he prayed for unity among his followers.
These things shouldn't come as a surprise to us. As Christians, we know, of course, that God loves and cares for us, that he answers our prayers.
I don't know, man. I was a Christian for a long time, and I can't think of a single instance of him answering my prayer in a meaningful way. Well, I can think of many times that he failed to answer my prayers, even when they were of a kind that he promises to always answer, like for healing. Again, the verses that say believers will be able to heal the sick do not specify that they will only be healed if God wills it. They just flat out say they will be healed. And yet, I attended a church with a woman who was dying of cancer and many times had been anointed with oil and prayed over with the laying on of hands as laid out in James chapter 5, but she still died of cancer. Of course, there are a myriad of excuses given for occurrences like this. Obviously, someone doing the praying wasn't sincere, and God will only answer the prayer if everyone involved was sincere, because he's a jerk like that. She didn't have enough faith in the healing, and healing only works if she has faith. Her death would cause a non-believer somewhere to come to God somehow, and so was used as an instrument to bring about that greater good. But none of these are actually biblical positions. The Bible promises that God will heal the sick person as long as the person doing the praying believes, and you can't tell me that there wasn't a single person in that church who sincerely believed. I know I did, But I also know that I'm likely to get no true Scotsman here because I don't believe now, so obviously my faith was never genuine to begin with, which seems like more than a bit of a cop-out if you ask me.
We could get together and share how time after time something in our lives seemed hopeless until God intervened with his saving hand.
No, I really can't. Even when I was a Christian, I couldn't think of a single time when God answered my prayer in a meaningful way. And I don't mean the simple "God helped me find my car keys" sort of prayers. I'm talking about the stories that I've always heard of someone not having enough money to make it through the month, putting their faith in God, and then suddenly a relative that they almost never speak to sends them a check for $10,000 because the Lord put it on their heart. Stories like that were commonplace, but I never saw anything like that in my own life. In fact, I became more financially stable than I had ever been before in my life, pretty much exactly when I became an atheist. That's when I had a better job just essentially drop into my lap through coincidence. Someone I knew from a previous job saw me in the parking garage where they worked as a manager and emailed me to send them my resume. I was hired immediately and went from working 14-hour shifts for less than minimum wage and very unreliable tips to working 7-hour shifts at a bit over minimum wage and only dinner shifts at that, which allowed me to spend more time with my kids during the day, not to mention working on my YouTube channel that would eventually replace this job, and with tips that reliably made up the difference in the number of hours worked between the two jobs, plus enough extra that allowed us to be comfortable as long as we were careful not to overspend. When I was a believer, God never dropped such an opportunity in my lap. So it seems to me that God answers prayers in that manner at about the same rate as random chance would, which leaves me wondering, God, what would you say you do here?
What would you say you do here?
When I was in high school, I planned to go to college. I found my dream school and couldn't wait to start. There was just one problem. College is expensive. I had no way of paying for it, and there was no chance that I was about to take out $200,000 worth of loans. I was stuck, and so I prayed to God, please help me. Wouldn't you know it, right around that time, my dad got a new job that paid a little bit more than the last one. Even more than that, the job was at a local university in the same system, and so they were willing to pay tuition exchange, taking care of more than 3/4 of my expenses, just like that.
Yeah, see? Stories like this are a dime a dozen. If I had still been a Christian and prayed for a better job while I was working in the dank cave that is the Rainforest Cafe, then when I got that email from my former coworker inviting me to send him my resume, I would have seen that as God answering my prayer, and it sounds like a powerful story. But it wasn't an answered prayer. It's just a coincidence. New jobs are a thing that happens sometimes. Running into old colleagues in unexpected places is a thing that happens sometimes. Hell, for all we know, the reason that Casey's dad got a new job at the local university in the same system as the school he wanted to attend was specifically because his dad knew what school he wanted to attend and knew it would be more manageable if he got a job at a university in that system, and so he went out and through his own hard work applied for and received that job. And now you're thanking God instead of your dad. I mean, I guess it's possible that the job just fell into his lap in a similar manner as my better job did, but Casey didn't give enough details for us to actually know that for sure, and I feel like if that were the case, then those details would be included, as that would make the argument that it was an answered prayer much stronger.
How true Psalm 138 is. On the day I called for help, you answered me.
Well, on the day I called for help, he left me with crappy jobs that had me wondering if I'd have enough money to buy more toilet paper when I ran out. And also, lest this be taken this way, I am not saying that if you become an atheist, your life will suddenly fall into place. I hope nobody would take that from my story, but I want to make that explicit. I was lucky. There was nothing special about me that made me deserve a good job more than anyone else. And not everyone will be lucky. This is exactly the kind of system we would expect from a godless universe, but not what we would expect from a god, especially not a god who claims to answer prayers.
How true Jesus' words are about prayer. And yet, as inspiring as stories like these are, as readily as each and every one of us could come up with a story of our own of how God answered our prayers.
See, that's called priming. This video isn't directed at atheists, it's directed at Christians who are wondering why God didn't answer their prayers, or the prayers of someone they know. So he tells a story of when God answered his prayer, and then talks about how easy it'll be for everyone to remember a time when that happened, which gets the person thinking back to a time when something coincidental happened in their life that ended up being a good thing for them, no matter how minor, and if they can't think of one right away, they will spend some time coming up with an answer that reinforces the idea that God does answer prayer, Right before he goes on to explaining that, no, actually, God doesn't answer prayers, at least not any better than random chance does, but you'd better attribute those random chance instances to God and not random chance, even though they happen for non-believers at pretty much the same rate. Or even a better rate in some cases, like that study that found that people who were being prayed for and knew about it had worse post-surgery outcomes than the people who were not being prayed for. If praying for me causes me to be more likely to experience complications rather than actual healing, then I'll take my chances with random chance, thanks very much. And now I'm half expecting to see the regular creationist trolls that show up in my comments, making it known that they are praying for me to have a long and healthy life so that I'll actually have a worse outcome in the end. That would work, right?
We can just as readily come up with instances in which he didn't. How often have we found ourselves in distress, alone and in desperate need, and heard nothing?
Yup. You'd expect that if a god was going to deny a prayer, he could at least go through the trouble of communicating that denial to us, instead of just ignoring us.
In gratitude, I present you this offering of cookies and milk. If you want me to eat them for you, give me no sign. That will be done.
Jesus tells us to knock and it shall be opened. I can think of plenty of times that I found nothing but a locked door. From the trivial things like praying that I'd pass a math test to quite serious things like praying for an end to war or for the healing of a sick relative. What I asked for never came.
Meaning that God broke his promise to open when you knock.
On more than a few occasions in our lives, we're left with a challenging question. How do we reconcile the fact that God tells us to trust in him, tells us to go to him in prayer, and we will not be turned away, with our experience of being turned away?
Well, the most obvious way to reconcile that is to come to realize that the God that is described by the Bible is not consistent with our observed reality, so if we side with reality here, that would mean that God does not exist. At least, not the God described by the Bible.
Now, obviously, I don't know the mind of God and don't claim to know how God works in every situation, and there are times, even as a priest, that I struggle with this question myself.
Hedging with the mysterious ways defense, I see, so that even if you can't come up with a reasonable answer, it comes down to God's ways are above our ways. Never you mind that he could have made us with the capability of understanding why he does things the way he does and chose not to. Just trust that he's real and answers prayers in the best way possible, even if everything points to it not actually being the best way possible.
Faith doesn't remove this question, but I do think it offers a few helpful answers. The first is that despite the sincerity of our prayers, there can be a flaw in our prayers.
Yeah, it's not that God doesn't answer prayers, it's that you didn't pray right. The problem isn't with God, it's with you. You did something wrong. You didn't believe hard enough. You didn't ask for the right thing. It's your fault. This is a disgusting answer when paired with the fact that a lot of people are out there praying to just have enough money to get by and then end up evicted, living on the street without their basic needs being met.
Sometimes we simply ask for the wrong things.
Which then brings us into the territory of God only answering the prayers for things that he was going to do anyway, which in this case would leave us wondering, what's the point in praying in the first place? If you ask for the wrong thing, you are denied. But if you ask for something that is in line with God's will, he grants it? But would he not do the thing that is in line with his will anyway, whether you ask for it or not?
I'll give you an example. When I was in college, my girlfriend broke up with me. It's okay. I'm over it now. She was the love of my life, and I was absolutely devastated.
And you responded by joining an order of monks who vow to stay celibate for their entire lives. That seems perfectly healthy.
I prayed to God that she would come back to me, that we would be together again. But she never did. And I got angry with God, wondered why he wasn't with me in my time of need. But as I've thought about it over the years, I've come to realize that it was kind of an unfair expectation of God. You see, God gives us each free will. He loves us enough to let us choose for ourselves what we do and who we love. In praying for my girlfriend to return, I was essentially asking God to take away her free will, to force her to do something that she did not want to do. This is not something that God will do, and so God couldn't answer my prayer as I wanted.
Okay, but the problem with that is that any prayer that isn't for something like nice weather or healing from disease or something like that, any prayer that involves other people in any way, will be violating free will in the same way as asking for your girlfriend to come back. You believe that God gave your dad a better job so that you could attend the school you wanted to. Did God mess with your father's free will so that he would apply for that job? Did he mess with the free will of the person who decided to hire your father? If he didn't, then that means that your father was going to apply for that job and be hired anyway without God's intervention, which means that he didn't actually answer your prayer. That's just what was going to happen. In order for that to actually be an answered prayer, he had to have interfered with someone's free will along the line, which you just said is a kind of prayer that he will not answer because he doesn't do that.
When we feel that God is not answering our prayers, it might be good to take a step back and look at what we're actually asking for. Is it reasonable? Is it something that fits with who we know God to be? Is it something that will ultimately continue the work of God, building the kingdom and leading to salvation?
Well, in the case of the woman who died of cancer in the church I used to attend, absolutely yes to all three, undoubtedly. And yet, God said no. Or rather, didn't bother to say yes, with the complete non-answer being the equivalent of a no, but without actually having him bother to tell anyone that his answer was no, leaving us to repeatedly pray for her healing for several years, despite God knowing that the ultimate answer would be no.
Or are we asking for something that contradicts the very nature of God?
Not sure how asking for healing for a believer would contradict God's nature when it says in God's word that he will heal believers. And more than that, would give believers the ability to heal anyone regardless of that person's belief status.
Sometimes God does not answer our prayers because there's something wrong with what we're asking for. If you ask God to not be God, your prayer is going to go unanswered.
Again, it's not that God isn't answering prayers, it's that there's something wrong with you. Kind of a gross message if you ask me.
Other times, the prayer is not that we ask incorrectly, but that we fail to see when our prayers are actually answered.
Yep, that woman dying of cancer was actually an answer to our prayer for healing. Sure.
We say that God is not listening, that our prayers have fallen on deaf ears. But maybe the problem is that we failed to even look. Maybe we failed to see what's right in front of us. How many times I've prayed for the recovery of a friend or family member, for help in a difficult time, only to forget about that prayer as soon as everything is all right.
That has literally never happened to me with anything that is actually a serious illness. And in any of the cases where someone in my life was healed from a serious illness, it had happened after I was an atheist. The primary example I can think of for that is when my son was hospitalized with severe bronchitis. I didn't pray for healing. I trusted in the medical staff to do the best that they could to help him heal. And they did. Notably, one of the nurses that was with him through the majority of that time was Muslim. It wouldn't surprise me one bit if she had at some point prayed to Allah for the healing of the little boy in her care, and he was healed. Does that count as points for Allah, or is it maybe just that he received top-notch medical care in a timely fashion?
God answered my prayer exactly how I asked, but I never even noticed. The person got better, the crisis was averted, and I never even made the connection that it was because God was with me.
Okay, I'm not going to continue to harp on this point, but it is an objectively true statement that my life has gotten better since I left Christianity behind. Those two things are only slightly related. Yes, having my YouTube channel as my job allows me a great degree of freedom that I wouldn't have had at any restaurant, but if I never started my channel, I'd still be happily serving up steaks at an overpriced steakhouse in Niagara Falls, making about the same amount of money as I'm making now, living a much better life than I ever did as a Christian.
If you've ever used a walkie-talkie, you know that in order to speak, you have to press down the button, and to listen, you have to let the button go.
Unless, of course, it's a movie and you need someone to hear the other side of that conversation for plot reasons.
Sometimes we never let the button go. We talk and talk and talk, waiting for an answer, but it never comes. God could be on the other end, answering away, but as long as we keep the button pressed down, as long as we refuse to listen, we'll never know it.
And this all-powerful being is apparently not strong enough to get around this human limitation? For which I'm sure the excuse will be something along the lines of, why would we expect God to force us to listen to him when we're not willing? When the fact of the matter is that the people in the situations described here would be more than willing to listen, if only he'd actually speak up a bit.
A lot of times, the answer is not that God won't answer our prayers, it's that he's presently working on it and is just not done yet.
Because the all-powerful creator of the universe is Limited by the time dimension that he supposedly exists outside of. Right. I'm skipping the next little bit. It's just him explaining that he prayed to God for guidance, and it took him a while in between praying for guidance and ending up deciding to be a Franciscan monk.
Looking back, I can see that it was those experiences that made me into the person I am today. That, honestly, without those struggles, I would likely have never become a Franciscan or priest.
Again, this video is directed at Christians, but as an atheist, I hear this and think, so without those struggles, you wouldn't be wasting your life in service to a deity that apparently does not exist, and to an organization that regularly covers up crimes like child rape? So I feel like a different path would have been better for you.
No, when things don't go as we want, we jump right to God doesn't answer my prayers.
Again, though, to bring it back around to the opening Bible verse, God says that he will answer your prayers, and he doesn't put all the conditions on them that you are. Those are entirely post hoc rationalizations designed to make you remember the hits and forget the misses, because the misses were your own fault for not asking God for what God was going to do anyway.
So yeah, sometimes we ask wrongly. Sometimes we can't see what's right before us. But other times, honestly, I think most of the time, the reason that we feel that God has abandoned us and locked the door is because we have a fundamentally skewed understanding of what prayer is.
Prayer is something that doesn't make sense in a universe with an all-knowing, all-powerful God who wants what is best for you. Because in such a world, God already knows what is best for you, and since he wants that and has the ability to make that happen, then that's exactly what he will do. Prayer is basically an admission that God is the kind of jerk who wants you to beg him to do the thing that he was going to do anyway. Thy will be done. God will do his will, no matter what, but he still wants to hear you beg him for it.
So often we approach God as if God were an all-powerful genie.
Well, that is how he presents himself in the verses where he says that he'll do anything we ask through prayer, like the one you opened this video with.
We come with requests, making known what we want, and do our best to convince God to give it to us. We say, Lord, your will be done, but in reality, what we're trying to do is conform God's will to be more like our own.
Yep, here we go. God will only grant a prayer if you pray for what God already wanted to do anyway. Sorry, but that makes God look like more of a mob boss than an all-loving being in my mind.
We want God to see the way we do, and so we get what we want. Does everyone see how there is something truly backwards about this?
Yeah, it's only backwards in the sense that prayer is an exercise in futility to begin with, given that God is going to do his will whether or not you pray for it.
Prayer, by its very nature, is not about convincing God to be more like us, but allowing God to transform us to be more like God.
So, to mess with our free will? I don't understand how this works in the framework that you've already laid out.
What we often misunderstand about prayer is that it's not about letting God do everything for us while we check out.
No, that's right. When God answers your prayers, it's through your own actions. So you answer your own prayers, and if your prayers go unanswered, that's also your fault. Almost as though God is superfluous in this whole thing. You do it yourself, or it doesn't get done. And if you do it yourself, that was God. If it doesn't get done, that's your fault for not asking right. What a toxic worldview.
It's about receiving grace and strength so that God can work through us. All throughout human history, God has used his servants and prophets to perform miracles. What made the prophets great was not that they were amazing speakers or had power within themselves. It was that they were so close to God in prayer that they knew what needed to be done.
Which, alarmingly frequently, was the genocide of another culture, whether that had to be the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, or any of the myriad of other genocides that God condones or commands in the Bible through his prophets.
They knew that they needed to take responsibility, to announce justice, to perform acts of charity, rather than going to God simply to deposit our prayer and walk away feeling like everything's been taken care of. Sometimes, the reason that our prayers seem unanswered is because we have failed to take what God has given us and put it towards what we hope for.
This message is so goddamn toxic. You're not good enough for God to answer your prayers. You're too selfish, asking for things that are against God's nature. You're too lazy, not doing what God requires of you in order to get what he promised would come through prayer. It's all you. God can do no wrong, even when he acts in a way that is explicitly contradicted by how the Bible says he will act. It's just gross.
In prayer, God offers us peace, inspiration, and strength, not so that we can feel good about ourselves, but so that we can take these things out to the world, to put to action the changes we know need to be done, to do our part in building up the kingdom.
Because, heaven forbid we actually feel good about ourselves ever. Gotta get that Catholic guilt in there somehow.
As long as we view prayer as a means of one-way communication, where all we're concerned with is trying to convince God to do things for us, we're going to ask for the wrong things.
Yeah, that's not what the Bible says. Maybe that is what some ancient theologian says that they think the Bible means when it says other things, but it's not what the Bible actually says.
We are going to fail to see God's work right in front of us. And we are most certainly going to miss opportunities for God to answer prayer through us. Ask, and it will be given to you.
As long as you ask for the right things in the right way.
On the day I called for help, you answered me.
As long as the call for help was made appropriately, and you worked toward and were successful at solving your own problems without prayer to begin with.
I believe these things to be true with all my heart.
Conditionally true, maybe.
God does answer our prayers. But I do not believe that God is simply going to do everything for us exactly as we want when we want it. If that is how we view prayer, then yes, unfortunately, we're going to feel that God doesn't answer our prayers from time to time.
I mean, that is how the Bible views prayer, but even so, even if we set that aside, God doesn't answer prayers any more reliably than random chance does, which then gives us no reason to think that God answers prayers to begin with.
And that would be a shame. If you're feeling distraught because of unanswered prayers, wondering where God is in a time of great need, it might be an opportunity to change your mindset.
Yeah, it would. The best change, in my opinion, would be to stop relying on an unreliable God, and do what you can to change your circumstances yourself. Of course, this is not always possible, but when it is possible, it's more empowering to stop thinking that a magical being will solve your problems for you, and work towards solving them for yourself. And as Casey has essentially said in this video, that's basically where God is going to leave you anyway, so you may as well act as though God doesn't exist, because God certainly acts that way.
Prayer is not about making God more like us. It's about making us more like God. Ask for that, and your prayer will always be answered.
Be the God of your own life, as apologists so often accuse atheists of doing anyway. It'll have the same result in the end. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Fook Yu, who says, minor nitpick, but persons don't get pregnant. Females get pregnant. This is a rather absolute in nature of mammals. Well, without getting into the details of just how complicated biological sex is, which, if you're interested, I'd recommend reading Dr. Stephen Novella's article on the science of biological sex, linked down below, but without getting into that, the only reason to point out that females are the ones who get pregnant, in response to me using the phrase pregnant people, is if you don't consider females to be people, which I do. So pregnant people is accurate, and there's really no good reason to object to that kind of inclusive language. Thanks for watching, thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon manager, thanks to this week's PayPal heroes Eric and Janice, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the prayers that are ignored by the God that is my channel. If you'd like your prayers to be answered with about the same effectiveness as praying to a milk jug, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!